What would you do if you had only one dose of medicine left, and death was knocking at your door? Most people would hold on to it with trembling hands, praying for one more sunrise. But, in the winter of 1891, in a forgotten corner of Montana Territory, a dying rancher made a choice that would echo through generations. He gave away his last chance at survival to a child he had never met before, a Native American girl from a tribe his own people had been fighting for decades. What happened next would make even the hardest skeptic believe that some things in this world cannot be explained by science or logic. This is not a fairy tale. This is not a legend passed down around campfires. This is the true story of Thomas Whitmore, a man who discovered that sometimes, when you give away everything you have, the universe gives back in ways you could never imagine. The winter of 1891 came early to the Montana Territory, and it came without mercy. The first snow fell in late October, thick and heavy, covering the land like a burial shroud. By November, the rivers had frozen solid, and the wind howled through the valleys with a voice that sounded almost human. Old-timers said they had never seen anything like it. The temperature dropped so low that cattle froze standing up in the fields, their bodies discovered days later, still upright, covered in ice and snow. Thomas Whitmore watched the storm from his cabin window and knew in his bones that this winter would be his last. He was 53 years old, though he looked much older. His hair had gone completely white, and his face was weathered like old leather from decades of working under the harsh Montana sun. His hands, once strong enough to break a wild horse, now trembled when he lifted his coffee cup. The cough that had started in the spring had grown worse with each passing month, and now it racked his body with such violence that sometimes he could not stand afterward. The doctor in town had given him the diagnosis 6 months earlier. Consumption, they called it. Tuberculosis. There was no cure, only medicine to ease the suffering and slow the progress of the disease. The doctor had handed Thomas a small bottle of laudanum and told him to make it last. "This is the best I can do for you," the doctor had said, his eyes filled with the helpless sadness of a man who had delivered this same speech too many times. "Come back when you need more, if you can make the journey." Thomas had made the journey twice since then, but now the winter had trapped him on his ranch. The nearest town was 15 miles away, and the snow had piled so high that the road was completely impassable. He had enough food stored to last until spring, if he was careful. He had enough firewood stacked against the cabin wall to keep himself warm. But the medicine was almost gone. There was perhaps 1 dose left in the bottle, maybe 2 if he diluted it heavily with water. After that, there would be nothing but pain and the slow suffocation as his lungs filled with fluid. He did not fear death. Thomas Whitmore had lived a hard life, and he had made his peace with the end long ago. What he feared was the manner of dying, the weeks or months of agony that lay ahead. He had seen men die from consumption before. He knew what was coming. The thought of it made him grip the medicine bottle tighter, knowing that each drop was precious, that each dose bought him a few more hours of relief. The ranch had been his whole life. He had come to Montana as a young man of 22, full of dreams and ambitions. He had worked for other ranchers for years, saving every penny, learning the trade, until he had enough money to buy his own piece of land. The land he chose was not the best, but it was his. It sat at the edge of the territory, where the prairie met the foothills of the mountains, where the grass grew tall in summer and the winters were brutal beyond description. Other ranchers had warned him against it. "Too close to Indian country," they said. "You'll lose half your cattle to raids and the other half to the cold." But Thomas was stubborn, and he had built his ranch there anyway. For 30 years, he had worked that land. He had raised cattle and horses, built fences and barns, dug wells and planted trees. He had survived droughts and floods, harsh winters and scorching summers. He had survived the Indian wars that had torn through the territory in the early years, though he had never raised his rifle against any of them. Thomas was not a fighting man by nature. He believed in leaving people alone if they left him alone, and, for the most part, that philosophy had served him well. He had married once, a woman named Sarah who had come west with her family when she was just 16. They had met at a church social in town, and Thomas had fallen in love with her gentle smile and kind eyes. They married in the spring of 1869 and built their life together on the ranch. Sarah had filled the cabin with warmth and laughter, had planted flowers around the front door, had made curtains for the windows and quilts for the bed. For 8 years, they had been happy. Then came the fever. It swept through the territory in the summer of 1877, killing indiscriminately. Young and old, rich and poor, settlers and natives alike fell before it. Sarah was one of the first to get sick, and one of the first to die. Thomas had buried her beneath the old oak tree behind the cabin, the same tree where they had sat together on summer evenings, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple. He had never remarried. He had never even considered it. Sarah had been his one true love, and, when she died, that part of his heart had died with her. Now, as he sat alone in his cabin listening to the wind howl outside, Thomas thought about Sarah more and more. He wondered if he would see her again after he died. He wondered if there was anything at all waiting for him on the other side, or if death was simply darkness and silence forever. He had been raised in the church, had believed in God and heaven as a child, but the hard years had worn away at his faith until only a thin thread remained. Still, sometimes at night, when the pain was bad and sleep would not come, he prayed. He prayed to see Sarah again. He prayed for an easy death. He prayed for the strength to face whatever was coming. The storm continued for 3 days without pause. The snow piled higher and higher, until it reached the bottom of the cabin windows. Thomas kept the fire burning constantly, feeding it logs from his dwindling supply. He ate sparingly, knowing that his food had to last. He slept when he could, though the coughing fits came more frequently now, leaving him exhausted and gasping for breath. The medicine helped, but he was rationing it so carefully that each dose barely took the edge off the pain. On the 4th day, the storm finally broke. Thomas woke to an eerie silence, the absence of the wind he had grown so accustomed to over the past days. He rose slowly from his bed, his joints stiff and aching, and made his way to the window. The sun was just coming up over the mountains, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold. It was beautiful, Thomas thought. After all these years, Montana could still take his breath away. He dressed warmly and opened the cabin door, stepping out onto the porch. The snow was nearly waist-deep, and the air was so cold that it burned his lungs when he breathed. He stood there for a moment, taking in the scene, knowing that this might be one of the last times he would see it. The ranch stretched out before him, the barn and outbuildings half buried in snow, the fences barely visible beneath the white drifts. Beyond the ranch, the prairie rolled toward the mountains, vast and empty and wild. It was then that he saw the movement. At first, he thought it was an animal, a deer, or perhaps a wolf struggling through the snow. But, as he watched, he realized it was a person. A small figure, moving slowly through the deep drifts, falling and rising and falling again. Thomas squinted against the glare of the sun on the snow, trying to make out more details. The figure was moving toward his cabin, though whether by intention or simply by chance, he could not tell. He went back inside and pulled on his heaviest coat, wrapped a scarf around his face, and grabbed his snowshoes from beside the door. It took him nearly 10 minutes to strap them on, his hands trembling from the cold and his own weakness. Then, he set out toward the struggling figure, moving as quickly as he could through the waist-deep snow. As he got closer, he saw that it was a child. A girl, no more than 8 or 9 years old, with black hair and dark skin. She was wearing a thin deerskin dress that was completely inadequate for the cold, and her feet were wrapped in strips of cloth that had long since soaked through. She was shivering so violently that her whole body shook, and her lips had turned a frightening shade of blue. When she saw Thomas approaching, she tried to run, but she was too weak. She collapsed into the snow and did not get up again. Thomas reached her and knelt down beside her. She was still conscious, but barely. Her eyes were glazed with fever, and, when he touched her forehead, he felt the heat radiating through his glove. She was burning up, despite the freezing temperature. She looked up at him with terrified eyes, and he realized with a start that she was a Native American child. Cheyenne, most likely, based on the design of her dress. Her people lived in the foothills to the north, or at least they had before the army had driven most of them onto reservations. "It's all right," Thomas said, keeping his voice soft and calm. "I'm not going to hurt you. Can you understand me?" Do you speak English? The girl stared at him for a long moment, then nodded almost imperceptibly. Help, she whispered. Please help. Thomas did not hesitate. He scooped her up in his arms, surprised at how light she was, how small. She weighed almost nothing, as if the fever had burned away everything but bone and skin. He carried her back to the cabin as quickly as he could, struggling against the deep snow, his lungs screaming in protest. By the time he reached the porch, he was coughing so hard that he could barely stand, but he did not stop. He carried the girl inside and laid her on his bed, covering her with every blanket he had. She was in bad shape. Thomas could see that at a glance. Her fever was dangerously high, and her breathing was shallow and rapid. There were sores on her feet where the cloth wrappings had rubbed through, and he suspected she had not eaten in days. He built up the fire until the cabin was almost uncomfortably warm, then set about doing what he could to help her. He stripped off her wet clothes and wrapped her in dry blankets, handling her as gently as he would have handled a wounded bird. He heated water and made a thin broth from the last of his dried meat, spooning it slowly into her mouth when she was conscious enough to swallow. He cleaned and bandaged her feet, wincing at the extent of the frostbite. She would be lucky if she did not lose her toes. As he worked, she drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes staring at him with those fever-bright eyes, sometimes mumbling in a language he did not understand. Once, she grabbed his hand and held on with surprising strength, looking up at him with desperate urgency. "My mother," she said. "My brother. They are still out there. In the snow. Please." Thomas felt his heart sink. "Where?" he asked. "Where are they?" But the girl had slipped back into unconsciousness, and she did not answer. Thomas stood there for a long moment, looking down at the child on his bed. He knew what he should do. He should go out and look for her family, try to find them before they froze to death in the snow. But he also knew his own limitations. He was sick and weak, and the effort of carrying the girl back to the cabin had nearly killed him. If he went out again, if he tried to search the endless white prairie for people who might already be dead, he would not make it back. He would collapse in the snow, just as the girl had, and, by the time anyone found him, he would be frozen solid. But he could not simply do nothing. Not while there was a chance that her family was still alive, still waiting to be found. He made his decision quickly, as he had always made decisions. He bundled up as warmly as he could, tucked his rifle under his arm in case he encountered any wolves, and headed back out into the cold. The sun was higher now, and the snow sparkled like a field of diamonds, so bright that it hurt his eyes. He followed the girl's tracks backward, though the wind had already begun to fill them in, and the going was slow and exhausting. He found them about a mile from his cabin, in a shallow depression where they had tried to shelter from the storm. The woman was lying on her side, her body curled protectively around a smaller form. Even from a distance, Thomas knew they were dead. There was a stillness about them, a frozen quality that went beyond mere sleep. He approached slowly, his heart heavy, and knelt down beside them. The woman was young, perhaps in her mid-20s. She had the same black hair and dark features as the girl, and Thomas guessed she was the mother. Her face was peaceful in death, her eyes closed, as if she had simply fallen asleep. The smaller form beside her was a boy, maybe 4 or 5 years old. He was tucked against his mother's chest, her arms wrapped around him, protecting him from the cold even in death. They had frozen to death together, holding each other, and Thomas found a strange sort of comfort in that. He stood there for a long time, looking down at them. He thought about burying them, but the ground was frozen solid, and he did not have the strength to dig even a shallow grave. He thought about bringing them back to the cabin, but he did not think he could manage it. In the end, he did the only thing he could. He marked the spot with a tall stick driven into the snow, so he could find it again when the spring thaw came. Then, he said a prayer over them, the same prayer he had said over Sarah all those years ago, and turned back toward the cabin. The girl was still unconscious when he returned, but her fever seemed worse. She was thrashing beneath the blankets, mumbling incoherently, her skin flushed and hot to the touch. Thomas knew enough about sickness to recognize the danger signs. If her fever did not break soon, she would die. And there was nothing he could do about it. He had no medicine strong enough to fight a fever this severe. Except for the laudanum. Thomas looked at the small bottle sitting on the shelf above his bed. The medicine would not cure her fever, but it would ease her suffering and help her rest. The doctor had told him that rest was often the best medicine for any illness. If the girl could sleep, if her body could fight the fever without the exhaustion of pain and fear, she might have a chance. But, if he gave her his medicine, he would have nothing left for himself. The pain in his chest was already growing worse, a constant burning pressure that made every breath an effort. Without the laudanum, the coming weeks would be agony. Without the medicine, he would die gasping and choking, unable to breathe, in more pain than he could imagine. He thought about Sarah. He thought about the promise he had made at her graveside, that he would live a good life, that he would try to be the kind of man she had believed him to be. He thought about all the things he had done wrong over the years, the moments of weakness and selfishness and fear. He thought about the woman and the boy lying dead in the snow, about the little girl fighting for her life in his bed. And he made his choice. He took the bottle from the shelf, measured out a careful dose, and mixed it with warm water. Then, he lifted the girl's head and helped her drink it, a little at a time, until she had swallowed every drop. Within minutes, her thrashing had calmed, and her breathing had eased. She settled into a deep sleep, her small hand still clutching the edge of the blanket, and Thomas sat back with a sigh that seemed to come from the very depths of his soul. He did not regret his decision. He had lived long enough, and he had lived well enough, and if his last act on this earth was to save the life of a child, then that was a good way to end. He settled into his chair beside the bed and watched the girl sleep, listening to the crackle of the fire and the occasional gust of wind against the cabin walls. The pain in his chest was growing worse, but he ignored it. There would be time enough for pain later. For now, he would watch over this child, this stranger who had stumbled into his life, and he would make sure she survived. That night, the fever broke. Thomas was dozing in his chair when the girl suddenly sat up, her eyes clear for the first time since he had found her. She looked around the cabin with confusion, then looked at Thomas with something like recognition. "You saved me," she said. Her voice was weak, but coherent. "Why?" Thomas smiled, though the effort hurt his chest. "Because you needed saving," he said. "That's reason enough." The girl stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to understand something she could not quite grasp. Then, she said, "My name is Little Dove. My mother called me Little Dove." "That's a beautiful name," Thomas said. "I'm Thomas. Thomas Whitmore." Little Dove nodded slowly. Then, her face crumpled, and the tears came. "My mother," she whispered. "My brother. They were with me. We were running from the soldiers. We got lost in the storm." She looked at Thomas with desperate hope. "Did you find them? Are they alive?" Thomas felt his heart break for her. He wanted to lie, to tell her that everything was all right, but he could not. She deserved the truth. "I found them," he said gently. "I'm sorry, Little Dove. I'm so sorry. They didn't make it." The cry that came from the child was the most heartbreaking sound Thomas had ever heard. It was raw and primal, a sound of grief that went beyond words, beyond tears. She sobbed until she had no more tears left, until exhaustion claimed her again, and she fell back into sleep. Thomas covered her carefully with the blankets, then sat back in his chair and stared into the fire. He did not sleep that night. The pain was too bad, and his mind was too full of thoughts. He thought about Little Dove and what would happen to her. He thought about her people, the Cheyenne, and the soldiers who had been hunting them. He thought about the world and all its cruelty, and he wondered why some people were forced to suffer so much while others seemed to glide through life untouched. By morning, he was coughing blood. He tried to hide it from Little Dove, but she saw. Children always see more than adults give them credit for. She watched him with those dark, knowing eyes as he wiped the blood from his lips, and she did not say anything. But, that afternoon, when he was resting and she thought he was asleep, she slipped out of the cabin and disappeared into the snow. Thomas woke to find her gone and felt a moment of panic. she was still weak, still recovering. She could not survive out there alone. He struggled to his feet and pulled on his coat, determined to go after her, but when he opened the door, he saw her coming back. And she was not alone. Walking beside her, supporting her with one strong arm, was an old man. He was Native American, that much was clear from his dress and features, but there was something else about him, something that made Thomas stop and stare. The old man seemed to radiate a kind of calm authority, a presence that filled the space around him. His face was weathered and lined, but his eyes were bright and sharp, missing nothing. Little Dove looked up at Thomas and smiled, the first smile he had seen from her. "This is my grandfather's brother," she said. "He is a medicine man. A healer. I went to find him. I told him what you did for me. I told him you gave me your medicine." She paused, and her smile faded slightly. "I told him you are dying." The old man stepped forward and looked at Thomas for a long moment. Then, slowly, he nodded. "You gave what you had to save a child of my people," he said. His English was heavily accented but clear. "You showed kindness where there has been only hate. For this, I have come." He reached out and placed one weathered hand on Thomas's chest, right over his heart. "Now, I will show you what our medicine can do." Thomas wanted to protest, wanted to say that there was no need, that he had made his peace with dying. But the words would not come. He looked into the old man's eyes and saw something there that he had not seen in a long time, something that might have been hope. And, despite everything, despite all his preparations for death, Thomas Whitmore found that he still wanted to live. The shaman guided him back inside, and the healing began. The shaman's name was Running Elk, and he was older than anyone Thomas had ever met. His face was a map of wrinkles, deep lines carved by decades of sun and wind and hardship. His hair was silver white, braided down his back, and his hands were gnarled like the roots of an ancient tree. But his eyes were young, bright and alert and filled with a wisdom that seemed to come from somewhere beyond ordinary human experience. When he looked at Thomas, it felt like he was looking straight through him, seeing things that Thomas himself did not know were there. Little Dove stayed close to her great uncle, watching everything with those dark, serious eyes. She had wrapped herself in one of Thomas's blankets and sat near the fire, her feet still bandaged, still healing from the frostbite. She did not speak much, but she watched. She watched Running Elk prepare his medicines, gathering strange herbs and powders from a leather pouch he carried at his waist. She watched Thomas coughing and struggling to breathe. She watched the fire dance and flicker, casting shadows on the cabin walls. There was a weight on her young shoulders that no child should have to carry, the weight of grief and loss and survival. Running Elk did not explain what he was doing. He moved through the cabin with quiet purpose, examining Thomas with careful attention, pressing his fingers against Thomas's chest and neck and forehead. He listened to Thomas breathe, counting each labored inhalation and exhalation. He looked at the blood that Thomas coughed up, studying its color and consistency. He smelled it, which Thomas found disturbing, though he did not say anything. When Running Elk was finished with his examination, he sat back on his heels and looked at Thomas with an expression that was impossible to read. "The sickness is deep," Running Elk said. "It has been growing inside you for many moons. The white man's medicine cannot cure it. Nothing can cure it, not completely." He paused, and Thomas felt his heart sink. He had known this, of course, but hearing it spoken aloud made it feel more real. But there are ways to fight it. Ways to slow it down. Ways to give you more time. "How much time?" Thomas asked. His voice came out as a croak, rough and strained from all the coughing. Running Elk did not answer directly. "The medicine I make will ease your pain," he said. "It will help you breathe. It will give your body strength to fight. But the sickness will not go away. It will always be there, waiting. You must make peace with this." Thomas thought about that for a moment. "I already have," he said finally. "I made peace with dying a long time ago. I just didn't expect to have company at the end." Running Elk smiled, the first smile Thomas had seen from him. It transformed his face, softening the hard lines and making him look almost kindly. "Perhaps that is why the spirits have sent Little Dove to you," he said. "Perhaps they did not want you to die alone." The shaman worked through the afternoon and into the evening, preparing his medicines with a care and precision that reminded Thomas of a master craftsman at work. He ground herbs together using a smooth stone and a wooden bowl, mixing them with water and animal fat and other substances that Thomas could not identify. He chanted softly as he worked, words in a language that Thomas did not understand, ancient words that seemed to vibrate in the air. Sometimes he stopped and closed his eyes, sitting perfectly still, as if he was listening to something that only he could hear. Little Dove helped where she could, fetching water and tending the fire and holding things when Running Elk needed an extra pair of hands. She did not seem surprised by any of it. Thomas guessed that she had grown up around medicine men, that this was as natural to her as farming was to a settler's child. She moved quietly and efficiently, anticipating what was needed before Running Elk even asked. There was a bond between them that went beyond words, an understanding that came from shared blood and shared culture and shared loss. When the medicine was ready, Running Elk brought it to Thomas in a small clay bowl. It was thick and dark and smelled like nothing Thomas had ever encountered before, a combination of earth and smoke and something else, something almost sweet. He looked at it skeptically, his years of white man's education telling him that this was nonsense, that no herbal mixture could cure what years of medical science could not. But another part of him, a part that was older and wiser and less bound by the assumptions of civilization, told him to trust. He had trusted his own medicine without question. Why should he not trust this? He drank the mixture in one long swallow. It was bitter and thick, coating his throat and stomach with a warmth that spread slowly through his body. Almost immediately, he felt the pain in his chest begin to ease. His breathing became less labored, less forced. The constant pressure that had been building behind his ribs for months seemed to lighten, just a little, just enough that he could take a full breath without gasping. "How do you feel?" Running Elk asked. Thomas took another deep breath, testing his lungs. "Better," he admitted. "The pain is less." Running Elk nodded as if this was exactly what he had expected. "The medicine will help for now," he said. "But it is not enough. The sickness in your body is strong. To truly fight it, we must go deeper. We must speak to the spirits and ask for their help." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the cold outside. "Speak to the spirits," he repeated. "I'm not sure I believe in spirits." Running Elk looked at him with those piercing eyes. "It does not matter whether you believe in them," he said. "They believe in you. They have watched you for many years, Thomas Whitmore. They have seen your kindness and your strength. They have seen the love you had for your woman, and the grief you have carried since she died. They know your heart, even if you do not know theirs." Thomas did not know what to say to that. The idea that unseen beings had been watching him, judging him, was both comforting and disturbing. He had always believed that a man's actions spoke for themselves, that the universe did not keep score or hand out rewards and punishments based on behavior. But, looking into Running Elk's eyes, he was no longer sure what he believed. "What do I have to do?" he asked finally. Running Elk smiled again. "Tonight, we will build a fire," he said. "And I will show you." The ceremony began after sunset. Running Elk had Thomas move his bed away from the center of the cabin, creating an open space on the floor. He built a small fire in that space, using wood that he had blessed with prayers and herbs. The smoke rose straight up toward the ceiling, curling and twisting in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. Running Elk sat on one side of the fire, and Thomas sat on the other, with Little Dove watching from her place near the wall. The shaman began to chant, his voice low and rhythmic, rising and falling like the wind. He reached into his pouch and pulled out a small drum, no bigger than a dinner plate, and began to beat it in time with his chanting. The sound filled the cabin, vibrating through the floor and walls, through Thomas's very bones. It was hypnotic, almost trance-inducing, and Thomas found his eyes growing heavy despite his determination to stay alert. The fire seemed to grow brighter as the ceremony continued. The flames danced and flickered, casting shadows that moved in ways that should not have been possible. Thomas watched, fascinated and frightened in equal measure, as the shadows on the walls began to take shape. He saw animals there, or thought he saw them. Wolves and eagles and bears, moving along the wall like living creatures, their eyes glowing in the firelight. Running elks chanting grew louder, more intense. He reached across the fire and took Thomas's hands in his own, gripping them with surprising strength. The heat from the flames should have burned them both, but Thomas felt nothing but warmth. He looked into Running Elk's eyes and saw something there that made his breath catch in his throat. The shaman's eyes had changed. They were no longer the eyes of an old man. They were deep and ancient and filled with a light that seemed to come from somewhere beyond this world. "Close your eyes," Running Elk commanded. "Let go of your fear. Let go of your pain. Let go of everything that holds you to this world. The spirits wish to speak with you." Thomas wanted to resist, wanted to pull away and return to the safety of his rational mind. But his body would not obey. His eyes closed of their own accord, and he felt himself falling into darkness that was not dark at all, but filled with colors he had never seen before, colors that had no names in any human language. He was not in the cabin anymore. He did not know where he was. There was ground beneath his feet, solid and real, but when he looked around, he saw nothing but mist and light. The air was warm and smelled of flowers and rain and things long forgotten. Somewhere in the distance, he heard the sound of running water, a river or a stream, flowing over rocks and through meadows. "Thomas," a voice said. And he knew that voice. He would have known it anywhere. He turned around, and there she was. Sarah was exactly as he remembered her, not as she had been in the last terrible days of the fever, but as she had been when they were young and in love and the whole world lay before them. Her hair was golden brown, falling in soft waves around her shoulders. Her eyes were blue like a summer sky, and they were filled with love, so much love that Thomas felt his heart break all over again. "Sarah," he whispered. He tried to go to her, to take her in his arms, but something held him back, an invisible barrier that he could not cross. "Is it really you?" She smiled, and it was like the sun coming out from behind clouds. "It's really me, Thomas. I've been watching over you. All these years, I've never left your side." Tears were streaming down his face, though he did not remember starting to cry. "I've missed you so much," he said. "Not a day has gone by that I haven't thought about you. I've been so alone, Sarah. So alone." Sarah's smile turned sad. "I know, my love. I've seen your loneliness. I've felt your pain. But you were never truly alone. I was always with you, even when you couldn't see me or feel me. And soon, when your time comes, we will be together again. Forever." Thomas wanted to reach out to her, wanted to cross whatever barrier separated them and hold her in his arms one last time. "Let me come with you now," he begged. "I'm so tired, Sarah. I'm tired of the pain, tired of the loneliness. I'm ready to let go." But Sarah shook her head. "Not yet, Thomas. It's not your time yet. There is still something you must do, someone you must help. The child, little dove. She needs you. She has lost everything, just as you did when you lost me. You must be there for her, must guide her and protect her until she is strong enough to face the world on her own." Thomas thought about the little girl back in the cabin, the orphan who had stumbled into his life by chance or fate or something in between. He thought about her grief, so raw and fresh, and her courage, so remarkable for one so young. He thought about how she had gone out into the cold to find help for him, a stranger who had shown her kindness when she expected only cruelty. "How long?" he asked. "How much time do I have?" Sarah's image began to waver, like a reflection in disturbed water. "Longer than you think," she said. "The medicine man's power is real, Thomas. It will not cure you, but it will give you time. Use it wisely. Love that child as if she were your own. Teach her to be strong, but also teach her to be kind. And when your time does come, when we are finally together again, you will bring her with you in your heart, and I will love her too." "Sarah, wait!" Thomas cried. But she was fading, slipping away from him like sand through his fingers. "I love you. I never stopped loving you." "I know," her voice came, soft as a whisper, distant as the stars. "I love you too, Thomas. Always and forever." And then, she was gone. Thomas opened his eyes with a gasp, like a man breaking the surface of deep water after too long underwater. He was back in the cabin, sitting across from Running Elk, the fire burning between them. But something had changed. The pain in his chest was almost gone. His breathing was deep and easy, easier than it had been in months. And there was a warmth in his heart, a sense of peace and purpose that he had not felt in years. Running Elk released his hands and sat back, his face drawn with exhaustion. The ceremony had taken something out of him, Thomas could see. The shaman looked older somehow, more fragile, as if the effort of bridging the gap between worlds had cost him dearly. "You saw her," Running Elk said. It was not a question. Thomas nodded, not trusting himself to speak. "The spirits are kind to you," Running Elk said. "They have given you a gift that few men receive. They have given you a reason to live." Thomas looked over at Little Dove, who had fallen asleep against the wall, her face peaceful in the firelight. He thought about what Sarah had said, about loving the child as if she were his own. He thought about the empty years that stretched behind him, and the years that might still lie ahead. He thought about the loneliness and the pain and the slow march toward death. And he thought about hope. "Thank you," he said to Running Elk. "I don't fully understand what happened tonight, but I know that something changed. Something important." Running Elk rose slowly to his feet, his old joints creaking with the effort. "The medicine I gave you will help your body," he said. "But what you experienced tonight will help your spirit. Both are necessary if you are to live. Remember that, Thomas Whitmore. The body and the spirit are not separate. They are one, and they must be healed together." He gathered his things and moved toward the door, pausing to look back at Thomas one last time. "I will come again," he said. "In 3 days, I will return with more medicine. Until then, rest. Let your body recover. And take care of Little Dove. She is more important than you know." Thomas wanted to ask what he meant by that, but Running Elk was already gone, slipping out into the cold night with the silence of a ghost. Thomas sat alone by the dying fire, thinking about everything that had happened, until sleep finally claimed him. When he woke in the morning, he felt better than he had in years. The days that followed were a time of healing and adjustment. Thomas's health improved slowly but steadily, the medicine doing its work inside his body. He still coughed, and there were still bad days when the pain returned with a vengeance, but overall, he was stronger. He could walk without gasping for breath. He could eat without feeling sick. He could even go outside for short periods, though the cold still hurt his lungs if he stayed out too long. Little Dove healed too, though her wounds were more than physical. The frostbite on her feet had not been as bad as Thomas had feared, and, with proper care, she would keep all her toes. But the loss of her mother and brother weighed heavily on her young heart. She had nightmares every night, crying out in her sleep, calling for people who would never answer. Thomas would sit with her during these episodes, holding her hand and speaking softly until she calmed. He did not know the right words to say, did not know how to comfort a child who had lost everything. But he was there, and sometimes that was enough. During the day, Little Dove was quiet but attentive. She watched Thomas with those dark eyes, learning his habits and routines. She helped where she could, fetching wood for the fire and water from the well, feeding the few chickens that had survived the storm. She was surprisingly capable for her age, used to hard work and responsibility. Thomas guessed that life among her people had not been easy, that children were expected to contribute from an early age. They did not talk much at first. The language barrier was part of it, though Little Dove's English was better than Thomas had expected. But there was also a wariness between them, a mutual uncertainty about what they were to each other and what their future held. Thomas was a white man, an enemy by the standards of her people. Little Dove was a native child, an outsider by the standards of his. The world they lived in had drawn clear lines between their kinds, lines that were enforced with violence and hatred on both sides. But those lines did not exist inside the cabin. Within those walls, they were just two people, both broken, both healing, both trying to find a reason to keep going. The first real conversation they had came on the third day, when Running Elk had not yet returned and the snow had begun to fall again. Thomas was sitting by the fire, whittling a piece of wood into no particular shape, when Little Dove came to sit beside him. "Why did you save me?" she asked. The question was direct, almost blunt, the way children often are when they want to understand something. Thomas considered the question carefully. "Because you needed help," he said finally. "I couldn't just leave you out there to die." Little Dove shook her head. "My people and your people are enemies," she said. "The soldiers killed my father 2 winters ago. They killed many of our warriors. They drove us from our land and sent us to the reservation. Why would you help someone whose people are your enemies?" Thomas stopped whittling and looked at her. "What happened between our peoples is not your fault," he said. "You're a child. You didn't kill anyone. You didn't take anyone's land. You were just trying to survive, same as everyone else." "But you are one of them," Little Dove insisted. "You are a white man. You live on land that once belonged to my ancestors." Thomas could not argue with that. It was true. The land his ranch sat on had been Cheyenne territory not so long ago. He had not taken it by force, but he had benefited from those who had. There was guilt in that, even if it was not a guilt he had chosen. "You're right," he said. "I am a white man, and this was your people's land. What happened to your people was wrong. I know that. I've always known that. But I can't change the past, Little Dove. I can only try to do what's right in the present." Little Dove was silent for a long moment, staring into the fire. Then, she said, "My mother used to say that a person's heart is more important than the color of their skin. She said that there were good people and bad people in every tribe, and that we should judge them by their actions, not their blood." Thomas smiled. "Your mother sounds like a wise woman." Little Dove's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back. "She was," she said. "She was the wisest person I ever knew." Thomas reached out and put his hand on her shoulder, the first time he had touched her since he had carried her to the cabin. She did not flinch or pull away. "I'm sorry about your mother," he said. "And your brother. I wish I could have saved them too." Little Dove nodded, accepting his words. "Then," she said, "when the spring comes, I must go back to my people. My grandfather is still alive, on the reservation. He will take care of me." Thomas felt a pang of something he did not want to examine too closely. The thought of the cabin being empty again, of being alone with his sickness and his memories, was more painful than he had expected. But he nodded. "Of course," he said. "When the spring comes, I will take you to your grandfather myself. I promise." Little Dove looked at him with an expression that was older than her years. "And what will happen to you?" she asked. "When I am gone, who will take care of you?" Thomas did not have an answer to that. Running Elk returned that evening, just as the snow was beginning to fall heavily again. He brought more medicine and more supplies, including food and warm clothing that Thomas suspected had come from other members of the tribe. The shaman examined Thomas carefully, checking his breathing and his heartbeat, looking into his eyes and listening to his chest. "The medicine is working," Running Elk pronounced. "Your body is fighting back. But you must continue to take it every day, without fail. If you stop, the sickness will return stronger than before." Thomas nodded. "I understand. How long will the medicine last?" Running Elk produced a leather pouch from his pack and handed it to Thomas. It was heavy, filled with the dried herbs and powders that went into the medicine. "This will last through the winter," he said. "When it runs out, I will bring more. But you must promise me something in return." Thomas raised an eyebrow. What? Running Elk glanced at Little Dove, who was watching them from across the cabin. She is special, the shaman said quietly. She has gifts that she does not yet understand. When she was a baby, I saw it in her. The spirits marked her for something, though I do not know what. You must protect her, Thomas Whitmore. Not just her body, but her spirit. Help her to grow strong. Help her to find her path. Thomas looked at the girl, so small and so brave, and felt something shift inside his chest. It was not love, not yet, but it was the beginning of something. A connection. A responsibility. A reason to keep fighting, even when the fight seemed hopeless. I will, he said. I promise. Running Elk smiled his rare smile. Good. Then, perhaps, when your time finally comes, you will leave this world knowing that you did something that mattered. That is more than most men can say. The shaman stayed the night, telling stories by the fire while Little Dove listened with wide eyes. He told of the old days, before the white men came, when the Cheyenne had roamed free across the plains. He told of great warriors and wise chiefs, of battles won and lost, of love and loss and the endless cycle of life and death. He told of the spirits that watched over all things, the ancestors who guided the living, the sacred places where the veil between worlds was thin. Thomas listened too, though he understood only some of what was said. The shaman's stories were different from the stories he had grown up with, shaped by a different land and a different people. But there were similarities too. Stories of courage and sacrifice, of good and evil, of the eternal human struggle to find meaning in a world that often seemed meaningless. In the end, Thomas thought, people were not so different from one another. They just told different stories about the same truths. When Running Elk left the next morning, Thomas felt strangely sad to see him go. The shaman had become something like a friend, or at least something more than a stranger. He shook Running Elk's hand in the white man's fashion, then surprised himself by embracing the old man in the way he had seen the Cheyenne do. Thank you, he said. For everything. Running Elk patted his back with one gnarled hand. Thank the spirits, he said. They are the ones who sent me. I am only their instrument. Then, he was gone, disappearing into the white wilderness as if he had never been there at all. The winter continued, brutal and unrelenting. The snow fell and fell, piling higher and higher, until the cabin seemed like a small island in an ocean of white. Thomas and Little Dove settled into a routine, dividing the work of survival between them. Thomas handled the heavier tasks, chopping wood and clearing snow, while Little Dove took care of the cooking and cleaning. They ate together and slept in the same room, divided by a curtain Thomas had hung for modesty. They talked more and more as the days passed, sharing stories and memories and dreams. Little Dove told Thomas about her life among the Cheyenne. She told him about her father, a warrior who had died fighting the soldiers 2 winters ago. She told him about her mother, who had raised her and her brother alone after that, struggling to survive in a world that had no place for them. She told him about the reservation, where her people had been forced to live, crowded together in conditions that bred sickness and despair. She told him about the night they had fled, when soldiers had come to take her mother away for some imagined crime, and how they had run into the storm, hoping to reach the mountains where some of the free Cheyenne still lived. Thomas told her about his own life in return. He told her about coming west as a young man, about building the ranch with his own hands, about meeting Sarah and falling in love. He told her about the fever that had taken Sarah, about the empty years that followed, about the slow creep of the sickness that was killing him now. He told her things he had never told anyone, things he had kept locked inside his heart for so long that speaking them felt like releasing a pressure that had been building for years. Somewhere along the way, without either of them quite realizing it, they became a family. It was not something that happened overnight. It was a gradual process, built up through 1,000 small moments. The first time Little Dove called Thomas by name without prompting. The first time Thomas laughed at something she said. The first time they sat together in comfortable silence, needing no words to fill the space between them. The first time Little Dove reached for his hand when she was frightened by a noise outside. The first time Thomas realized that he was no longer just surviving, but actually living again. The winter was still harsh, and the sickness was still inside him, waiting. But, for the first time in years, Thomas Whitmore had something to live for. And that made all the difference. The spring came slowly to Montana, arriving in fits and starts like a shy guest who cannot decide whether to stay or go. First the days grew longer, the sun staying above the horizon a little longer each evening. Then, the temperature began to rise, the bitter cold giving way to a milder chill that almost felt like warmth after the brutal winter. The snow began to melt, slowly at first, then faster and faster, until streams of water ran everywhere, cutting channels through the white drifts and pooling in every low spot. Thomas watched the thaw from his cabin window and felt a strange mixture of emotions. He was relieved that the winter was ending, that the worst of the cold was behind them. But he also felt a gnawing anxiety in his chest, a worry that had nothing to do with his sickness. The spring meant change. It meant that Little Dove would leave, would return to her people on the reservation. It meant that the strange little family they had built over these long months would come to an end. He tried not to think about it. He focused instead on the work of the ranch, on the 1,000 tasks that needed to be done now that the weather was breaking. The cattle that had survived the winter were thin and weak, and they needed to be tended carefully if they were to recover. The fences had been damaged by the heavy snows, and many sections needed to be repaired or replaced entirely. The barn roof had a leak that Thomas had been putting off fixing, and now water dripped steadily through the hole, creating a muddy puddle on the floor below. Little Dove helped with everything, working alongside Thomas with an energy and determination that belied her small size. She had grown stronger over the winter, both in body and in spirit. The grief for her mother and brother was still there, would probably always be there, but she had learned to carry it differently. It was no longer a crushing weight that threatened to overwhelm her. It was a part of her now, woven into the fabric of who she was, something that made her stronger rather than weaker. She had changed in other ways too. Her English had improved dramatically, thanks to the long conversations she and Thomas had shared during the winter months. She could read a little now, having studied the few books that Thomas kept in the cabin, and she could write her name in the white man's letters. Thomas had taught her these things without really meaning to, simply by including her in his daily activities, by treating her as a partner rather than a burden. For his part, Thomas had changed as well. The medicine that Running Elk had given him continued to work its mysterious magic, keeping the worst of the symptoms at bay. He still coughed sometimes, and there were still days when the pain flared up and left him gasping, but those days were fewer and farther between. He had regained some of the weight he had lost, and his face had color again. He moved with more energy, more purpose, as if the prospect of living had renewed his strength in ways that medicine alone could not explain. But he knew better than to hope for too much. The sickness was still inside him, waiting. It would come for him eventually, as it came for everyone who had it. The question was not whether he would die, but when, and what he would do with the time he had left. One morning in early April, when the last of the snow was melting into muddy rivers and the first green shoots were beginning to appear in the meadows, Thomas sat Little Dove down and had a conversation he had been dreading for weeks. "It's time," he said. "The passes will be clear soon. We should start making plans to take you back to your people." Little Dove looked at him with those dark, knowing eyes. She did not seem surprised. She had probably been waiting for this conversation just as he had been dreading it. "My grandfather is on the reservation," she said. "He is old, but he is still alive. My mother's sister is there too, with her children. They will take care of me." Thomas nodded, trying to ignore the tightness in his throat. "I'll take you myself," he said. "It's a long journey, but the weather should be good. We can take the wagon and make it in a few days." Little Dove was silent for a long moment. Then, she said, "I don't want to go." Thomas blinked, caught off guard by the simple declaration. "What do you mean?" Little Dove stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the melting snow. "I don't want to go to the reservation," she said. "I don't want to leave here. I want to stay with you." Thomas felt his heart squeeze painfully. He had not allowed himself to hope for this, had not allowed himself to even think about it. The idea that Little Dove might want to stay with him, might choose him over her own people, was more than he had dared to imagine. "Little dove," he said carefully, "your family is on the reservation. Your grandfather, your aunt, your cousins. They're your people. They'll take care of you in ways that I can't." Little Dove turned to face him, and Thomas saw that there were tears in her eyes. But her voice was steady, determined in a way that reminded him of Sarah, of the way Sarah used to sound when she had made up her mind about something. "You are my family now," she said. "You saved my life. You took care of me all winter. You taught me to read and write. You told me stories and held my hand when I had nightmares. You are the only father I have ever really known. My birth father was a stranger to me. He was always away, always fighting. But you, Thomas, you have been here. Every day. That is what a father is." Thomas could not speak. The emotions that welled up inside him were too big, too overwhelming. He opened his mouth, closed it again, opened it once more. "I'm dying," he finally managed. "The medicine is helping, but it won't last forever. One day, probably sooner rather than later, I won't be here anymore." "What will you do then?" Little Dove walked back across the room and stood before him. She reached out and took his hand, her small fingers gripping his with surprising strength. "Then, I will take care of the ranch," she said. "I will remember everything you taught me. I will keep your memory alive, just as you keep your Sarah's memory alive. And, when my time comes, I will go to join you, and we will be a family again." Thomas felt tears running down his weathered cheeks, and he did not try to wipe them away. He pulled Little Dove into his arms and held her close, feeling her small body against his, feeling the warmth and life of her. "All right," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "All right. You can stay. We'll figure out the rest as we go." The decision, once made, changed everything. Thomas began to think about the future in ways he had not allowed himself to before. He thought about the ranch and what would happen to it after he was gone. He thought about Little Dove and what she would need to survive in a world that was often cruel to those who were different. He thought about the legal challenges, the practical difficulties, the thousand obstacles that stood in their way. The first problem was the law. Little Dove was a Native American child, and, by the laws of the territory, she belonged on the reservation with her people. If the authorities found out that Thomas was harboring her, there could be serious consequences for both of them. He could be fined or even jailed. She could be taken away by force and sent back to the reservation whether she wanted to go or not. Thomas thought about this problem for several days, turning it over in his mind, looking for a solution. Finally, he came up with a plan. It was risky and probably illegal, but it was the best option he could think of. He would adopt her. Officially, legally, through the proper channels. He would tell the authorities that she was an orphan he had found during the winter storm, that he did not know what tribe she belonged to or where she had come from. He would claim that she had been wandering alone, half-frozen and starving, with no memory of her past. It was a lie, of course, but it was a lie that could protect her. The nearest town was 15 miles away, a small settlement called Millbrook that served as the commercial and legal center for the surrounding ranches. Thomas had not been there in months, not since before the winter began. He had avoided it because of his sickness, because he did not want to answer questions or deal with the pity in people's eyes. But now he would have to go. He would have to talk to the judge, file the necessary papers, make his case. He explained his plan to Little Dove, making sure she understood the risks and the reasons. She listened carefully, her face serious, and, when he was finished, she nodded. "I understand," she said. "You want to protect me. But what if they find out the truth? What if someone recognizes me?" Thomas had thought about that too. "We'll change your appearance a little," he said. "Cut your hair shorter, dress you in the white man's clothes. When you speak, use only English, and try to lose as much of your accent as you can. If anyone asks, you'll say you don't remember your past, that the cold and the trauma made you forget." Little Dove looked uncertain. "I don't want to pretend to be something I'm not," she said. "I am Cheyenne. That is who I am. Thomas knelt down so he could look her in the eye. "I know," he said. "And you will always be Cheyenne, in your heart, no matter what. This is not about forgetting who you are. This is about surviving in a world that is not always kind to your people. Sometimes, to survive, we have to adapt. We have to wear masks. But the mask is not who you are. It's just protection, like a shield in battle." Little Dove considered this for a long moment. "Then," she said, "my mother used to say something similar. She said that the Cheyenne had always adapted to survive. When the buffalo moved, we followed them. When the seasons changed, we changed with them. Maybe this is just another kind of adaptation." Thomas smiled. "Your mother was very wise." Little Dove smiled back, the first real smile he had seen from her since she had learned of her mother's death. "Yes," she said. She was. The journey to Millbrook took 2 days. They traveled in Thomas's old wagon, pulled by his 2 remaining horses, moving slowly along roads that were still muddy from the spring thaw. Little Dove sat beside Thomas on the driver's seat, dressed in a plain cotton dress that had once belonged to Sarah. Her long black hair had been cut to shoulder length, and she wore a bonnet that partially hid her features. She did not look exactly like a white child, but she did not look obviously Native American either. Thomas had coached her on what to say and how to act. She was to pretend to be shy and withdrawn, to speak only when spoken to avoid eye contact with strangers. If anyone asked about her past, she was to shake her head and look confused, as if the memory was too painful or too lost to retrieve. It was not a comfortable role for her, Thomas could see, but she played it well. Millbrook was a small town, barely more than a main street with a few dozen buildings clustered around it. There was a general store, a saloon, a livery stable, a church, and a handful of other businesses and homes. The courthouse was at the far end of the street, a 2-story wooden building with a flag flying from a pole out front. Thomas had been there once before, years ago, to register the deed to his ranch. He remembered the judge as a stern but fair man, a former lawyer from back east who had come west looking for a simpler life. He left Little Dove in the wagon with strict instructions not to talk to anyone, then went inside the courthouse to find the judge. The building was quiet, almost empty in the middle of a weekday afternoon. A clerk sat behind a desk near the entrance, a young man with glasses and an ink-stained shirt, who looked up with mild curiosity when Thomas entered. "Can I help you?" the clerk asked. Thomas explained that he wanted to see the judge about adopting a child. The clerk's eyebrows rose slightly, but he made no comment. He simply led Thomas down a hallway and knocked on a door at the end. "Come in," a voice called. The judge's office was small and cluttered, the walls lined with books and papers, a single window providing a view of the dusty street outside. The judge himself sat behind a massive wooden desk, a large man with gray hair and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. He looked up as Thomas entered, recognition flickering across his features. "Thomas Whitmore," the judge said. "Haven't seen you in years. Heard you'd been sick." Thomas nodded. "I have been, Your Honor. But I'm doing better now, thanks to some help I received." The judge gestured to a chair in front of the desk. Sit down, sit down. The clerk says you want to adopt a child. That's a bit unusual, isn't it? You've been alone on that ranch for, what, nearly 20 years now?" Thomas settled into the chair, trying to ignore the nervous flutter in his stomach. 15 years since my wife passed," he said. "And, yes, I've been alone. But, this winter, I found a child. A little girl, half frozen in the snow during that big storm in November. I took her in, nursed her back to health. She's been living with me ever since." The judge leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Found a child, you say? Where did she come from? Who are her parents?" Thomas had practiced his answer to this question. "I don't know, Your Honor. She was wandering alone when I found her, barely conscious. She can't remember much about her past. The cold and the trauma seem to have affected her memory. I've asked around, but no one has reported a missing child. I think she must have been abandoned or orphaned." The judge studied Thomas with those sharp blue eyes, and Thomas had the uncomfortable feeling that the man saw right through him. But the judge did not call him out on the lie. Instead, he simply asked, "Where is the child now?" "Outside, in my wagon." "Would you like to meet her?" The judge nodded and rose from his chair. Together, they walked out to the street, where Little Dove sat waiting. She had followed Thomas's instructions perfectly, keeping her head down, her hands folded in her lap, her expression blank and withdrawn. When the judge approached, she looked up at him with wide, frightened eyes and scooted closer to Thomas's side of the wagon. "Hello there," the judge said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "What's your name?" Little Dove glanced at Thomas, then back at the judge. "I don't know," she whispered. "I don't remember." The judge nodded slowly. "And what about your parents? Do you remember them?" Little Dove shook her head, her lower lip trembling. "No. I don't remember anything. Just snow and cold and then waking up in the cabin." The judge stood there for a long moment, looking at the child. Thomas held his breath, waiting for the accusation, the challenge, the demand to know the truth. But it never came. "All right," the judge said finally. "Let's go back inside and fill out the paperwork." The adoption process took several hours. There were forms to fill out, questions to answer, documents to sign. Thomas chose the name Sarah for Little Dove's legal identity, after his late wife. It felt right, somehow, a way of connecting his old family to his new one. The judge asked about Thomas's ability to provide for the child, about his health, about his plans for her education. Thomas answered honestly where he could and lied where he had to. Finally, it was done. The judge signed the papers, stamped them with an official seal, and handed a copy to Thomas. "Congratulations," the judge said. "You're now the legal guardian of one Sarah Whitmore." Thomas thanked him and turned to leave, but the judge's voice stopped him at the door. "Mr. Whitmore." Thomas turned back. "Yes, Your Honor?" The judge's eyes were knowing, but not unkind. "I've been doing this job for a long time," he said. "I've seen a lot of people come through these doors, with all kinds of stories. Some true, some less so." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "I don't know where that child came from, and I'm not going to ask. But I know good people when I see them, and I know when someone is trying to do the right thing. Take care of her, Thomas. That's all I ask." Thomas nodded, relief flooding through him. "I will, Your Honor. I promise." The journey back to the ranch was lighter than the journey out. Little Dove, now legally Sarah Whitmore, sat beside Thomas with a smile on her face, the tension of the past few days finally lifting from her small shoulders. The sun was shining, the birds were singing, and the world seemed full of possibilities. "You lied for me," Little Dove said, as they rolled along the muddy road. "You lied to the judge." Thomas nodded. "I did." "Why?" Thomas thought about how to answer that. "Because sometimes the rules don't match up with what's right," he said finally. "The law says you should be on the reservation. But I don't think that's what's best for you. I think you belong here, with me. Sometimes you have to break the rules to do what's right." Little Dove considered this. "My mother used to say that the Great Spirit sees all things," she said. "She said that if you do something with a pure heart, even if it goes against the rules of men, the Great Spirit will understand." Thomas smiled. "Then, maybe the Great Spirit and I are on the same side." Little Dove smiled back and leaned against his shoulder. "I think you are," she said. When they got back to the ranch, Running Elk was waiting for them. The shaman was sitting on the porch, smoking a long pipe, looking as if he had been there for hours. Thomas was surprised to see him, though he did not know why he should be. Running Elk had a way of appearing when he was needed, as if he could sense when something important was happening. "I heard about what you did," Running Elk said, as Thomas helped Little Dove down from the wagon. "The news travels fast among my people." Thomas felt a flash of worry. "Is that going to be a problem?" he asked. "Will her grandfather be angry?" Running Elk shook his head. Her grandfather understands. He knows that the reservation is no place for a child like Little Dove. He knows that she has a better chance here, with you. He has given his blessing. Thomas felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he had not even realized was there. Thank you, he said. For everything. I don't know how to repay you. Running Elk stood and knocked the ashes from his pipe. You have already repaid me, he said. That night in the storm, when you gave your medicine to a child you did not know, you showed me that there are good men among your people. That was payment enough. He walked over to Little Dove and placed his hands on her shoulders, looking down at her with solemn affection. You have a new name now, he said. A new life. But do not forget who you are, little one. The Cheyenne blood runs in your veins. The spirits of your ancestors watch over you. Wherever you go, whatever you become, you will always be one of us. Little Dove hugged him fiercely, burying her face against his chest. I won't forget, she promised. I will always remember. Running Elk stroked her hair gently, then stepped back. I must go now, he said. My people need me. But I will come again when I can. And if you ever need help, just send word. The wind will carry your message to me. He turned and walked away, disappearing into the forest with the same silent grace he always had. Little Dove watched him go, tears streaming down her face, but she did not call him back. She understood, as Thomas did, that some farewells were necessary, even when they hurt. Thomas put his arm around her shoulders and guided her toward the cabin. Come on, he said. Let's go home. The spring continued its slow march toward summer. The days grew longer and warmer, the grass grew tall and green, the cattle began to regain the weight they had lost during the winter. Thomas and Little Dove worked side by side, building and repairing, planting and tending, creating something together that was more than just a ranch. It was a life. Thomas taught Little Dove everything he knew about ranching. He showed her how to repair a fence and how to birth a calf, how to predict the weather by the color of the sky and how to track an animal by its footprints. He taught her to ride, putting her on the gentlest of his horses and walking beside her until she was confident enough to ride alone. He taught her to shoot, starting with tin cans on fence posts and working up to hunting rabbits and prairie chickens for their dinner. Little Dove was a quick learner, absorbing knowledge like a sponge absorbs water. But she also taught Thomas things in return. She taught him about her people's ways of reading the land, of understanding the patterns of nature that the white man often overlooked. She taught him which plants were good for eating and which were good for medicine, knowledge that had been passed down through generations of Cheyenne women. She taught him songs and stories, tales of heroes and spirits that seemed to make the land come alive in a new way. Most importantly, she taught him how to laugh again. Thomas had not realized how long it had been since he had truly laughed, until one day when Little Dove was trying to milk the cow and ended up covered in milk from head to toe after the ornery animal kicked over the bucket. She sat there on the barn floor, dripping with milk, a look of such utter indignation on her face that Thomas burst out laughing. He laughed until tears streamed down his face, until his sides ached and he could barely breathe. And then, Little Dove started laughing too, and they sat there together in the hay, covered in milk and manure, laughing like fools. It was a small moment, insignificant in the grand scheme of things. But, for Thomas, it was a turning point. He realized that he had been living in the shadow of death for so long that he had forgotten how to live in the light. Little Dove had reminded him. She had brought joy back into his life, a joy he had thought was lost forever. The summer came, hot and dry, bringing with it new challenges and new opportunities. The cattle thrived on the rich grass of the pastures, growing fat and healthy. Thomas made the trip to Millbrook twice to sell some of his stock, bringing back supplies and news from the outside world. He kept Little Dove away from town as much as possible, not wanting to risk anyone asking too many questions about the dark-eyed girl who had suddenly appeared in Thomas Whitmore's life. But he could not keep her isolated forever. Word had spread through the ranching community about Thomas's adopted daughter, and curiosity brought visitors to the ranch. Some came with genuine good intentions, wanting to meet the child and welcome her to the neighborhood. Others came with suspicion in their eyes, wondering where the girl had really come from, what her story really was. Thomas handled each visitor carefully, sticking to the story he had told the judge. Little Dove played her part perfectly, acting shy and withdrawn, speaking only when spoken to, giving nothing away. Most people accepted the story at face value. A few seemed skeptical, but they kept their doubts to themselves. In this part of the country, people understood that everyone had secrets, and asking too many questions was considered rude. One visitor, however, was different from the rest. His name was Captain Marcus Wheeler, and he was an officer in the United States Army, stationed at the fort some 50 miles to the east. He arrived one afternoon in late July, riding up to the ranch on a fine black horse, his uniform crisp and his manner formal. He was a handsome man in his 40s, with graying hair and cold gray eyes that seemed to miss nothing. Thomas met him on the porch, his hand resting casually near the rifle that leaned against the wall. "Can I help you, Captain?" Wheeler dismounted and tipped his hat politely. "Good afternoon, Mr. Whitmore. I'm Captain Marcus Wheeler, commanding officer of Fort Sherman. I apologize for the intrusion, but I'm here on official business." Thomas felt his heart begin to beat faster, but he kept his face neutral. "What kind of official business?" Wheeler looked around the ranch, his eyes taking in every detail. "There have been reports of Cheyenne Indians leaving the reservation without permission," he said. "Some have been spotted in this area. I'm conducting a survey of local ranches to see if anyone has any information." Thomas forced himself to remain calm. "I haven't seen any Indians around here," he said. "It's been a quiet summer." Wheeler nodded slowly. "I've also heard rumors about a child. A girl. Some people say she appeared at your ranch during the winter storm, with no explanation of where she came from." Thomas's stomach tightened. "My daughter, Sarah," he said, using the name on the adoption papers. "I found her during the blizzard last November. She was half frozen and nearly dead. I took her in and adopted her legally. You can check with Judge Harrison in Millbrook if you have any questions about the paperwork." Wheeler's eyes narrowed slightly. "I see. And where did this child come from before you found her?" "I don't know," Thomas said. "She has no memory of her past. The cold and the trauma affected her mind. She can't remember anything before I found her." Wheeler was silent for a long moment, his gray eyes boring into Thomas's face. Then, he said, "Might I meet the child? Just to satisfy myself that everything is in order?" Thomas wanted to refuse. Every instinct told him to send this man away, to protect Little Dove from those cold, probing eyes. But refusing would only raise more suspicion. If he had nothing to hide, there was no reason not to let the captain see her. "Of course," he said. "Wait here. I'll bring her out." He found Little Dove in the barn, brushing one of the horses. Her face went pale when he told her about the visitor. "A soldier," she whispered. "Thomas, if he finds out who I am." Thomas knelt down and took her hands in his. "He won't find out," he said firmly. "You just have to be brave and stick to the story. Can you do that?" Little Dove took a deep breath and nodded. "I can do it." They walked back to the porch together. Wheeler was exactly where Thomas had left him, standing with his hands clasped behind his back, watching the horizon with those cold eyes. He turned as they approached, and his gaze fell on Little Dove. For a long moment, no one spoke. Thomas watched Wheeler's face, looking for any sign of recognition, any hint that the captain knew the truth. But Wheeler's expression remained unreadable. "Hello there," Wheeler said finally. "What's your name?" Little Dove dropped her gaze to the ground, playing her part perfectly. "Sarah," she said softly. "Sarah Whitmore." "Sarah," Wheeler repeated. "That's a pretty name. And how old are you, Sarah?" "I'm not sure," Little Dove said. "I don't remember much from before I came here." Wheeler nodded slowly. "Mr. Whitmore tells me he found you during the blizzard last winter. Can you tell me anything about what happened before that? Where you were coming from? Who you were with?" Little Dove shook her head. I don't remember. Sometimes I have dreams, but when I wake up, they're gone. All I know is what Thomas has told me. Wheeler studied her for a long moment. Thomas could see the wheels turning behind those cold gray eyes, the suspicion warring with uncertainty. But, in the end, the captain seemed to accept her story. Very well, he said. I'm sorry to have disturbed you, Mr. Whitmore. If you do see any Indians in the area, please send word to the fort immediately. We've had reports of unrest on the reservation, and we're trying to prevent any incidents. Thomas nodded. I'll keep my eyes open. Wheeler mounted his horse and rode away without looking back. Thomas and Little Dove stood on the porch and watched him go, neither of them speaking until he had disappeared over the horizon. That was close, Little Dove said quietly. Thomas put his arm around her shoulders. Yes, he agreed. It was. We'll have to be more careful from now on. The summer continued, but the shadow of Captain Wheeler's visit hung over them. Thomas began to take extra precautions, making sure Little Dove stayed out of sight whenever strangers came to the ranch. He taught her to recognize the sound of approaching horses, to know when to hide and when it was safe to come out. It was a stressful way to live, always looking over their shoulders, always waiting for the other shoe to drop. But, despite the fear, there were also moments of joy. Thomas's health continued to improve, the medicine working its slow magic inside his body. He had more energy now than he had had in years, enough to work a full day and still have strength left over. He even began to think that maybe, just maybe, he might have more time than he had expected. More time to watch Little Dove grow up. More time to teach her everything she needed to know. More time to live. Running Elk came back in September, as the leaves were beginning to turn. He brought more medicine and news from the reservation. The situation there was growing worse, he said. The government had cut rations again, and many people were going hungry. There was talk of resistance, of fighting back against the soldiers who treated them like prisoners. Running Elk was worried. If there is trouble, he told Thomas, it will spread. The soldiers will come looking for anyone who might be connected to the resistance. They will ask questions. They will search for runaways. Thomas understood what he was saying. Little Dove, he said. They might come looking for her. Running Elk nodded. You must be prepared. If the soldiers come, if they find out who she really is, they will take her away. They might punish you for harboring her. You must have a plan. Thomas had been thinking about this for months, though he had not wanted to admit it. If it comes to that, he said slowly, I could take her somewhere safe. I have a friend in Oregon, another rancher, who owes me a favor. He could hide her until things settle down. Running Elk considered this. It is a good plan, he said. But let us hope it does not come to that. The old shaman stayed for 3 days, performing ceremonies and making more medicine. He spent hours talking with Little Dove in their native language, reminding her of her heritage, teaching her things that she would need to know. Thomas watched them together and felt a complicated mixture of emotions. Gratitude that Little Dove had someone to connect her to her past. Fear that one day she might decide to go back to her people and leave him behind. Guilt for wanting to keep her all to himself. Before he left, Running Elk pulled Thomas aside for a private conversation. The medicine I have given you has done its work, he said. Your body is stronger now, stronger than it has been in many years. But the sickness is still inside you. It will never be completely gone. You must continue to take the medicine every day, without fail. If you stop, the sickness will return. Thomas nodded. I understand. Running Elk looked at him with those deep, knowing eyes. There is something else, he said. Something I have not told you before. The spirits have shown me things. Things about your future, and about Little Dove's future. Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. What things? Running Elk was silent for a long moment, as if choosing his words carefully. I have seen a crossroads, he said. A moment when everything will change. I do not know when it will come or what form it will take. But I have seen you standing at that crossroads, and I have seen the choice you will have to make. What choice? Running Elk shook his head. That, I cannot tell you. The spirits do not reveal everything, only glimpses, hints of what is to come. But, I will say this, when the moment comes, trust your heart. Your heart has always led you true, Thomas Whitmore. It led you to save Little Dove when you could have left her to die. It led you to give her a home when you could have turned her away. Trust your heart, and you will make the right choice. Thomas did not know what to say. The shaman's words were vague, mysterious, the kind of prophecy that could mean anything or nothing. But he could not shake the feeling that they were important, that something was coming that would test him in ways he could not yet imagine. Thank you, he said finally. For everything. I don't know where I would be without you. Running Elk smiled his rare smile. You would be dead, he said simply. But the spirits had other plans for you. They have always had plans for you, Thomas Whitmore. You just did not know it until now. Then, he was gone, disappearing into the forest as he always did, leaving Thomas alone with his thoughts and his fears and his hopes. The autumn came, brilliant and brief, painting the landscape in shades of gold and red. Thomas and Little Dove worked together to prepare for the coming winter, stockpiling food and firewood, repairing the cabin and the outbuildings, making sure everything was in order. They had survived one winter together, and they were determined to survive another. But, beneath the busy surface of their days, both of them were waiting. Waiting for the knock on the door. Waiting for the soldiers to come. Waiting for the crossroads that Running Elk had spoken of. They did not have to wait long. The crossroads came in early November, almost exactly 1 year after the blizzard that had brought Little Dove into Thomas's life. It began with smoke on the horizon. Thomas saw at first a thin dark column rising against the gray sky to the north. At first he thought it might be a forest fire, though the season was wrong for that. Then, he thought it might be someone burning brush, clearing land for a new homestead. But, as the hours passed and the smoke grew thicker, darker, more ominous, he began to suspect something far worse. By afternoon, refugees began arriving. They came on foot and on horseback, in wagons and on mules, their faces pale with shock and fear. They were settlers from the homesteads to the north, families who had carved out lives in the wilderness, who had built farms and ranches and dreams in the shadow of the mountains. Now they were running, fleeing something that they could barely bring themselves to describe. Thomas stopped the first wagon that came past his ranch, a family with 3 young children huddled in the back among their hastily packed belongings. The father was a man named Jensen, someone Thomas had met a few times at the general store in Millbrook. His face was covered in soot and his hands were shaking. What's happening? Thomas asked. What's causing all that smoke? Jensen's eyes were wide and haunted. Indians, he said, the word coming out like a curse. They've left the reservation. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands. They're burning everything in their path. Homesteads, barns, crops. They killed the Henderson family this morning. All of them. Even the children. Thomas felt his blood run cold. Which tribe? Where are they headed? Cheyenne, mostly. Some Lakota too. They're moving south, toward the fort. The army's been called out, but nobody knows if they can stop them. Jensen grabbed Thomas's arm with desperate strength. You need to get out, Whitmore. Take your family and run. These Indians aren't taking prisoners. They're out for blood. Thomas looked back toward the cabin, where Little Dove was watching from the window. He thought about what this news would mean to her, what it would do to her to know that her people were being blamed for violence and murder. He thought about what it might mean for them both if the soldiers came looking for anyone with Native American blood. Thank you for the warning, he told Jensen. You'd better keep moving. Get as far south as you can. Jensen nodded and whipped up his horses, the wagon lurching forward down the muddy road. More refugees followed, an endless stream of fear and desperation, all heading south, all running from the violence that was sweeping down from the north. Thomas went back to the cabin and told Little Dove what he had learned. She listened in silence, her face growing paler with each word. When he finished, she sat down heavily in one of the chairs, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes staring at nothing. "My people," she said quietly. "They're fighting back." Thomas knelt down beside her. "I don't know the whole story," he said. "I don't know why they left the reservation or what started this. But I know that things are going to get dangerous for us. The soldiers will be looking for anyone who might be connected to the uprising. They might come here." Little Dove looked at him with those dark, knowing eyes. "You should send me away," she said. "If I stay here, you will be in danger too. They will think you are helping the resistance." Thomas shook his head firmly. "I'm not sending you anywhere," he said. "We're family. We stick together, no matter what. We'll figure this out, just like we've figured out everything else." Little Dove's eyes filled with tears. "I don't want you to get hurt because of me," she said. "I would rather go back to my people than see you suffer." Thomas took her hands in his. "Listen to me," he said. "I made a promise to you, and I made a promise to your great uncle. I said I would protect you, and I meant it. Whatever happens, we face it together. Do you understand?" Little Dove nodded slowly. "I understand." They spent the rest of the day preparing. Thomas loaded his rifle and his shotgun, making sure both were clean and ready. He packed a bag with essential supplies, in case they needed to leave quickly. He moved the horses from the far pasture to the corral near the cabin, where he could get to them fast if necessary. He boarded up the windows that faced north and cleared away anything that might provide cover for attackers approaching the house. Little Dove helped with everything, her small hands working alongside his larger ones. She did not cry or complain, did not give voice to the fear that Thomas knew she must be feeling. She simply worked, focused and determined, trusting him to keep her safe. Night fell early, as it always did in November. Thomas lit a single lamp in the cabin and positioned himself by the window, watching the darkness for any sign of movement. The smoke to the north had grown thicker during the day, a dark smudge against the sky that seemed to swallow the stars. He could not see any flames, but he could imagine them, racing through homesteads and fields, consuming everything in their path. Little Dove tried to sleep, but Thomas could hear her tossing and turning in her bed. Finally, around midnight, she gave up the pretense and came to sit beside him at the window. "What do you think will happen?" she asked. Thomas considered the question. "I don't know," he admitted. "The army will probably put down the uprising eventually. They have more guns, more soldiers, more resources. But, in the meantime, a lot of people are going to get hurt. On both sides." Little Dove was quiet for a moment. Then, she said, "Do you think my people are wrong? For fighting back?" It was a hard question, one that Thomas had been struggling with himself. "I think your people have been treated badly," he said slowly. "I think they've been lied to and cheated and pushed onto land that nobody else wanted. I think they've watched their children go hungry while the government broke promise after promise. I understand why they're angry." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "But I also think violence only leads to more violence. I think that when this is over, your people will have lost even more than they had before. The government will use this as an excuse to take away what little they have left. It's not fair, but that's how it works." Little Dove nodded slowly. "My mother used to say the same thing. She said that the old ways of war were over, that the Cheyenne had to find new ways to survive. She said that fighting the white man was like fighting the river. You might win for a moment, but eventually the water will sweep you away." Thomas put his arm around her shoulders. "Your mother was a wise woman," he said. "I wish I could have met her." Little Dove leaned against him. "She would have liked you," she said. "She always said that a person's heart was more important than the color of their skin. She would have seen your heart, Thomas. She would have known you were a good man." They sat together in silence, watching the darkness, waiting for whatever was coming. The first riders appeared just before dawn. There were 5 of them, approaching the ranch from the north, moving fast but not rushing. Thomas watched them through his rifle scope, trying to make out details in the gray pre-dawn light. They were not soldiers, that much was clear. Their clothes were a mixture of Native American and white man's dress, and they carried a variety of weapons, from rifles to bows to what looked like a cavalry saber. Thomas felt his heart begin to pound. These were likely warriors from the uprising, scouts perhaps, or raiders looking for supplies. They might pass by the ranch without stopping. Or they might decide to investigate. Either way, he needed to be ready. "Get into the root cellar," he told Little Dove. "Don't come out until I tell you it's safe." Little Dove hesitated. "What if they hurt you?" "They won't," Thomas said, with more confidence than he felt. "I've never raised a hand against any Indian. I'm hoping they'll see that and leave me alone. But if something does happen, you stay hidden. No matter what you hear, no matter what happens, you stay in that cellar until they're gone. Promise me." Little Dove's eyes were filled with fear, but she nodded. "I promise." She disappeared through the trapdoor in the floor, pulling the rug back over it to conceal the entrance. Thomas watched her go, then turned back to the window. The riders were closer now, close enough that he could make out their faces in the growing light. They stopped at the edge of his property, conferring among themselves. Thomas could see them pointing at the cabin, at the corral, at the barn. They were discussing whether to investigate or move on. He held his breath, his finger resting lightly on the trigger of his rifle. One of the riders broke away from the group and approached the cabin alone. He was a young man, probably no more than 20, with long black hair and a rifle slung across his back. He rode with the easy grace of someone who had spent his whole life on horseback. He stopped about 50 yards from the porch and called out in a language Thomas did not understand. Thomas stepped out onto the porch, keeping his rifle at the ready but not pointing it at the young man. "I don't speak your language," he called back. "But, I mean you no harm. I'm just a rancher trying to get by." The young man studied him for a long moment. Then, to Thomas's surprise, he switched to English. "You are alone here?" Thomas hesitated. Lying would be dangerous. If they searched the cabin and found Little Dove, it would only make things worse. But telling the truth might be worse still. "I live alone," he said. "Have for years." The young man did not seem convinced. He looked at the cabin, at the curtains and the windows, at the smoke rising from the chimney. "It is strange," he said, "for a man to keep such a clean house. I think perhaps you are not telling me the truth." Thomas tightened his grip on the rifle. "What I tell you is my business. I haven't done anything to harm your people. I just want to be left in peace." The young man considered this. Then, slowly, he raised his hand and gave a signal to the others. They began to approach, fanning out to surround the cabin. Thomas felt his heart sink. This was going to end badly. He was outnumbered, outgunned, and outmaneuvered. Even if he managed to take down 1 or 2 of them, the others would overwhelm him easily. But he did not lower his rifle. He would not go down without a fight. Then, from behind him, he heard the trapdoor creak open. "No," he shouted, but it was too late. Little Dove emerged from the root cellar and walked past him onto the porch. She stood there in the morning light, small and defiant, facing the warriors with her chin held high. She began to speak. Not in English, but in Cheyenne, her voice ringing out clear and strong. Thomas could not understand the words, but he could see the effect they had on the young warrior. His expression shifted from suspicion to shock to something that looked almost like awe. The young man responded, his voice uncertain now, questioning. Little Dove answered, her voice never wavering. Back and forth they went, the exchange growing more intense, until finally, the young man raised his hand again. The other warriors stopped where they were, their weapons lowering slightly. The young man dismounted and walked toward the porch. Thomas tensed, ready to fight, but the warrior did not approach aggressively. Instead, he stopped a few feet from Little Dove and studied her face intently. "You are Metaflower's daughter," he said in English, his voice filled with wonder. Everyone thought you were dead. Little Dove nodded. I nearly was. This man saved my life. The young warrior looked at Thomas with new eyes. The suspicion was still there, but it was tempered now by something else. Respect, perhaps. Or at least curiosity. You saved a Cheyenne child, he said. Why would a white man do such a thing? Thomas kept his rifle at the ready, but his voice was calm. Because she needed help. Because it was the right thing to do. Because a person's worth isn't determined by the color of their skin or the language they speak. The young warrior considered this for a long moment. Then, he turned to his companions and spoke rapidly in Cheyenne. There was discussion, argument, raised voices. But, in the end, the young warrior seemed to prevail. The other warriors lowered their weapons completely and stepped back. My name is Running Wolf, the young warrior said, turning back to Thomas. I was a friend of Little Dove's father. We rode together in many battles before the soldiers came. He paused. What you did, saving this child, it is not forgotten. I will tell the others. No warrior will harm this house or anyone in it. You have my word. Thomas let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. Thank you, he said. But, what about the soldiers? What about the uprising? What happens when this is over? Running Wolf's face grew hard. When this is over, there will be more death. More suffering. More broken promises. But, that is for later. For now, we fight. We make the white man remember that we are still here, that we will not go quietly into darkness. He mounted his horse and looked down at Little Dove one last time. You have found a good home, little one. Your mother would be proud. Then, to Thomas, take care of her, white man. She is one of our sacred ones. The spirits have marked her for something important. I do not know what, but I feel it. Then, they were gone, riding south, disappearing into the morning mist. Thomas and Little Dove stood on the porch and watched them go, neither of them speaking. You shouldn't have come out, Thomas said finally. You could have been killed. Little Dove shook her head. They would never have hurt me, she said. I am Cheyenne. Despite everything, despite this white man's dress and this white man's name, I am still one of them. They would have recognized me eventually, even if I had stayed hidden. And, then, they would have thought you were keeping me prisoner. They would have killed you for that. Thomas realized she was right. Her instinct had probably saved his life. What did you say to them? He asked. Little Dove was quiet for a moment. I told them who I was, she said. Who my mother was, who my father was. I told them how you found me in the snow and nursed me back to health. I told them how you gave me your last medicine, even though you were dying. I told them that you had adopted me as your own daughter, that you had lied to the white man's authorities to protect me. I told them that you were a good man, one of the few good men I had ever known among your people. She looked up at Thomas with those dark, knowing eyes. I told them the truth. The uprising continued for 3 more weeks. The newspapers called it the Winter War, a desperate last stand by the Cheyenne and their allies against the forces that had taken everything from them. The army mobilized in full force, bringing in troops from as far away as Texas and California. There were battles and skirmishes, victories and defeats on both sides. And there was death. So much death. Thomas and Little Dove watched it all from a distance, listening to the rumors that passed through Millbrook, reading the newspapers when they could get them. They learned of massacres and atrocities, of whole villages burned and whole families killed. They learned of treaties signed and broken, of promises made and forgotten. They learned that the world outside their little ranch was a brutal, unforgiving place, where the strong survived and the weak were trampled underfoot. True to Running Wolf's word, no warriors came to harm the ranch. In fact, twice during the conflict, small groups of Cheyenne passed by and left gifts on the porch. Food, mostly, preserved meat and dried berries. Once, there was a beautiful beaded necklace that Little Dove recognized as belonging to one of her aunts. They were gestures of gratitude, acknowledgments of the debt that Running Wolf had spoken of. But the soldiers were another matter. Captain Wheeler returned in late November, at the head of a patrol that was sweeping the area for any remaining hostile forces. He rode up to the ranch with a dozen armed men behind him, his face cold and suspicious. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, without dismounting, "I've received reports that Cheyenne warriors were seen at this ranch during the uprising. Reports that they left without attacking you or taking anything. I find that unusual." Thomas met his gaze steadily. "They stopped by once," he said. "Asked for water and directions. I gave them both. Then, they left. That's all that happened." Wheeler's eyes narrowed. "Is that so?" "Because my sources tell me that your adopted daughter spoke to them in their own language. That she seemed to know them. That she convinced them to leave peacefully." Thomas felt the familiar cold dread settling into his stomach. But he kept his voice calm. "My daughter learned a few words of Cheyenne from a book," he said. "She's always been good with languages. She used what little she knew to communicate that we meant no harm. That's all." Wheeler looked past Thomas to where Little Dove was standing in the doorway of the cabin. She met his gaze without flinching, her face calm and composed. "Come here, child," Wheeler commanded. Little Dove walked forward slowly, her movements careful and measured. She stopped beside Thomas and looked up at the captain with those dark, inscrutable eyes. "What is your name?" Wheeler asked. "Sarah Whitmore," Little Dove replied, her voice steady. "And where were you born?" "I don't know. I don't remember anything before Mr. Whitmore found me in the snow." Wheeler leaned forward in his saddle, his eyes boring into hers. "And yet you spoke to those warriors in their own language. You seemed to know them. How do you explain that?" Little Dove did not flinch. "I was scared," she said. "I thought if I could make them understand that we meant no harm, they would leave us alone. I said the only words I knew. Friend. Peace. No fight. It seemed to work." Wheeler stared at her for a long moment. Thomas held his breath, waiting for the accusation, the arrest, the violence that might follow. But none of it came. Finally, Wheeler sat back in his saddle. "Very well," he said, though his voice was grudging. "But I'll be keeping an eye on this ranch, Mr. Whitmore. If I find out you've been harboring hostiles, there will be consequences." He wheeled his horse around and rode away, his men following behind him. Thomas and Little Dove watched them go, neither of them speaking until the last soldier had disappeared over the horizon. "That was close," Little Dove said quietly. Thomas nodded. "Too close. We need to be more careful." The uprising ended in early December, with the surrender of the last Cheyenne war chiefs. The newspapers declared it a great victory for civilization, a triumph of order over chaos. But Thomas knew the truth. There were no winners in a war like this. Only survivors and casualties, and the long, slow work of trying to rebuild what had been destroyed. Running Elk came to the ranch a week after the surrender. He looked older than Thomas had ever seen him, as if the conflict had aged him years in just a few weeks. His eyes were haunted, filled with a grief that went beyond words. "It is over," the shaman said, sitting by the fire in Thomas's cabin. "My people have been broken. Again. The survivors will be sent back to the reservation, where they will be watched more closely than ever. Many of those who fought will be hanged or imprisoned. The old ways are truly dead now." Thomas did not know what to say. There were no words that could comfort a man who had watched his people's last hope extinguished. Running Elk looked at Little Dove, who sat across from him, her face solemn. "You did well," he told her. "When the warriors came, you used your knowledge to protect this house and the man who has protected you. That took courage." Little Dove shook her head. "I did nothing special. I just told the truth." Running Elk smiled his sad smile. "Sometimes the truth is the most powerful thing we have." He turned to Thomas. "I have brought more medicine. Enough to last through the winter.
But this may be the last time I can come.
The soldiers are watching everyone who leaves the reservation.
It is too dangerous.
Thomas felt a chill run through him.
What will I do when the medicine runs out?
Running Elk reached into his pouch and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I have written down the recipe, he said. The herbs you need grow wild in these mountains. I will show you which ones and where to find them. You can make the medicine yourself, once you know how. They spent the rest of the day in the forest, Running Elk pointing out plants and explaining their properties. Some Thomas recognized from his years on the land. Others were completely new to him. He listened carefully, taking notes, asking questions, committing everything to memory.
This knowledge might be the difference between life and death.
Before he left, Running Elk performed one final ceremony. It was simpler than the first one, just a prayer and a blessing, spoken in Cheyenne with Little Dove translating softly into English. But there was power in it, Thomas could feel it. A connection to something greater than himself, something that stretched back through generations and would continue long after he was gone. You have been given a gift, Running Elk said when the ceremony was over.
Time. Time that you would not have had otherwise. Use it well. Love this child who has become your daughter. Teach her to be strong. Teach her to be kind.
And, when your time finally comes, go with a peaceful heart, knowing that you have made a difference in this world.
Thomas embraced the old shaman, holding him close. Thank you, he said. For everything.
Running Elk pulled back and looked at him with those deep, knowing eyes.
Thank the spirits, he said. They are the ones who have guided your path. I am only their humble servant.
Then, he was gone, fading into the forest like a ghost, leaving Thomas and Little Dove alone once more. The winter settled in, cold and quiet. Thomas and Little Dove went about their lives, tending the ranch, reading by the fire, talking about everything and nothing. The threat of the soldiers hung over them, but it grew smaller with each passing day.
Captain Wheeler did not return.
The uprising faded from the newspapers, replaced by other stories, other concerns. Christmas came, and Thomas surprised Little Dove with a gift. It was a silver locket, one that had belonged to Sarah, with a small portrait of Thomas and Sarah together painted inside. He had added a new picture to the other side, a sketch he had made himself of Little Dove's face. I'm not much of an artist, he admitted, as she opened the locket and looked at the images inside. But I wanted you to have something to remember us by. Both of us. The family you came from and the family you found. Little Dove's eyes filled with tears. She threw her arms around Thomas and held him tight. I love you, she said. You're my father. My real father, the only one that matters. I will never forget you, no matter what happens. Thomas held her close, feeling the warmth of her, the life of her. He thought about Sarah, about the family they might have had, about all the years he had spent alone. And he realized that the pain of losing Sarah, as terrible as it had been, had led him to this moment. To this child who had stumbled into his life and changed everything. Maybe there was a plan after all. Maybe the spirits really were watching. Maybe everything happened for a reason, even the things that seemed senseless and cruel. Or maybe not. Maybe life was just a series of accidents and coincidences, without meaning or purpose. It did not matter. What mattered was this moment, this connection, this love that he had never expected to find. I love you too, he told Little Dove. You are my daughter. My heart. My reason for living. Outside, the snow fell softly, covering the land in a blanket of white. Inside, the fire crackled and the lamp flickered, casting warm shadows on the walls. And two people, bound not by blood but by something stronger, sat together in the silence, grateful for each other and for the time they had been given. The years passed like seasons, each one bringing its own joys and sorrows, its own challenges and triumphs. Thomas Whitmore had been told he was dying, had been told that his time was short, had been told to prepare for the end. But the end did not come. Not that winter, not the winter after, not for many winters to come. The medicine that Running Elk had given him, combined with the recipe Thomas now made himself from the herbs of the forest, continued to hold the sickness at bay. It was not a cure. The consumption was still inside him, waiting, biding its time. But it was contained, controlled, held in check by the mysterious power of the Cheyenne medicine. Little Dove grew up. She was 10 years old that first winter, when she had stumbled half-frozen into Thomas's life. By the time she was 15, she had transformed from a frightened child into a capable young woman, strong and confident and sure of her place in the world. She had mastered the work of the ranch, could ride and shoot and tend cattle as well as any man. She had continued her education, reading every book Thomas could find for her, writing letters and essays that would have impressed a college professor. She had even learned to make the Cheyenne medicine herself, taking over that task from Thomas when his hands became too unsteady to measure the delicate proportions. The outside world continued to change. The territory became a state, with new laws and new institutions. The railroads expanded, bringing more settlers, more towns, more of the civilization that had driven the Cheyenne from their lands. The reservation system grew more entrenched, the Native Americans pushed further and further to the margins of society. Running Elk had been right. The old ways were truly dead, replaced by a new order that had little room for those who remembered what had been lost. Thomas watched these changes with a mixture of resignation and hope. The world was changing, yes, but not all the changes were bad. The violence of the frontier was fading, replaced by a more settled, peaceful existence. Towns were growing, schools were opening, churches were being built. People were finding new ways to live together, to bridge the gaps between cultures and histories. It was not perfect, far from it, but it was better than the bloodshed that had come before. Little Dove, now known to the world as Sarah Whitmore, navigated these changes with remarkable grace. She learned to move between two worlds, white and native, keeping parts of both inside her. She attended the church in Millbrook on Sundays, learning the hymns and prayers that Thomas had grown up with. But she also kept her Cheyenne heritage alive in private, speaking the language, practicing the ceremonies, remembering the stories that Running Elk had taught her. She was a bridge between two peoples, though she did not yet know what that might mean for her future. The suspicious looks and whispered questions that had followed her in the early years gradually faded. The people of Millbrook and the surrounding ranches came to accept her as Thomas Whitmore's adopted daughter, a mysterious foundling with no memory of her past. Some probably guessed the truth, but none spoke it aloud. In this part of the country, people understood that everyone had secrets, and asking too many questions was still considered rude. Thomas's health had its ups and downs. There were good years, when he felt almost normal, when he could work a full day without rest and still have energy left over. And there were bad years, when the coughing returned and the blood came up and he spent weeks in bed, fighting for every breath. Each time he got sick, he feared it would be the end. Each time, the medicine pulled him back from the brink. It was as if the spirits Running Elk had spoken of were not yet ready to let him go, as if there was still something he needed to do, some purpose he had not yet fulfilled. When Little Dove turned 18, Thomas had a conversation with her that he had been putting off for years. They were sitting on the porch of the cabin, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple, just as Thomas and Sarah had done so many years before. "I need to talk to you about the future," Thomas said. "My future, and yours." Little Dove turned to look at him, her dark eyes curious. She had grown into a beautiful young woman, with her mother's grace and her father's strength. Looking at her sometimes, Thomas could see echoes of both the Cheyenne girl who had stumbled out of the blizzard and the white rancher's daughter she had become. "What about the future?" she asked. Thomas took a deep breath. "I'm not going to live forever," he said. "The medicine has given me years I didn't expect to have, but the sickness is still inside me. One day, probably sooner rather than later, it's going to win." Little Dove's face grew serious. "I know," she said. "I've always known. I just try not to think about it." Thomas reached over and took her hand. "When I'm gone," he said, "everything I have will pass to you. The ranch, the land, the cattle, the horses. It's all in my will, filed with the court in Millbrook. You'll be a woman of property, independent and self-sufficient. No one will be able to take that away from you." Little Dove nodded slowly.
I understand.
But, there's something else, Thomas continued.
Something I've been thinking about for a while now.
This ranch has been my whole life.
I've poured everything I have into it. But, it's just land.
Just buildings and animals and fences.
It doesn't mean anything unless it's used for something good.
He paused, gathering his thoughts.
When I'm gone, I want you to use this place for something meaningful. Something that will help people. I've been thinking about the reservation, about your people there, struggling to survive in conditions that would break most men.
Maybe there's a way this ranch could help them. A place where young people could come to learn, to gain skills that would help them in the white man's world. A bridge between their heritage and the future they're being forced to live in. Little Dove's eyes widened.
You want to turn the ranch into a school? Thomas shook his head. Not exactly. I don't know what exactly. But, I want you to think about it. You understand both worlds better than anyone I know.
You know what your people need, and you know what they're up against. When the time comes, I trust you to make the right decision. Little Dove was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the sunset. Thomas could see the thoughts moving behind her eyes, the wheels turning in her mind. That's a big responsibility, she said finally.
I know, Thomas agreed.
But, you're ready for it.
I've watched you grow up, Little Dove. I've seen the woman you've become.
You have strength and wisdom beyond your years. Whatever you decide to do with this place, I know it will be the right thing. Little Dove turned to face him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I'll make you proud, she said.
I promise.
Thomas smiled and squeezed her hand. You already have, he said. You've made me prouder than I ever thought possible. Every day that I've had with you has been a gift. I wouldn't trade any of it, not for all the years in the world.
The seasons turned, and Thomas's health began to decline.
It was gradual at first, so gradual that he barely noticed it. He would get tired more easily, need to rest more often, find himself short of breath after even mild exertion. Then, it became more pronounced, more difficult to ignore. The coughing came back, worse than before. The blood returned to his handkerchief. The pain in his chest grew sharper, more constant, more impossible to dismiss. Little Dove nursed him through each episode, as he had once nursed her. She made the medicine with practiced hands, measured the doses carefully, sat by his bedside through the long nights when the fever burned and the coughing would not stop. She read to him from books they both loved, told him stories of her people, sang him songs in the language of her ancestors. She was gentle and patient and tireless, never complaining, never showing the fear that Thomas knew she must feel.
Running Elk came one last time, in the autumn of 1899.
The shaman was old now, ancient, his face a map of wrinkles, his hands gnarled and trembling. He moved slowly, leaning on a walking stick, but his eyes were still bright and sharp. I have come to say goodbye, Running Elk said, settling into a chair beside Thomas's bed.
My time is short.
The spirits have been calling me for many moons now, and soon I must answer. Thomas felt a deep sadness at these words. Running Elk had become a friend over the years, more than a friend, a brother of the spirit if not of blood. The thought of losing him was almost as painful as the sickness that was killing Thomas. Thank you, Thomas said, his voice weak but sincere.
For everything you've done. For saving my life.
For giving me these extra years. I would have died that first winter if not for you. Running Elk smiled his rare smile. You saved yourself, he said. When you gave your medicine to Little Dove, when you chose another life over your own, you showed the spirits the quality of your heart. They decided then that you deserved more time.
I was merely their instrument.
Thomas thought about that long ago night, about the choice he had made without hesitation. He had not thought of himself as heroic at the time. He had simply done what seemed right, what seemed necessary. But, perhaps that was what heroism was. Not grand gestures performed for applause, but small acts of kindness performed without thought of reward. Running Elk reached into his pouch and pulled out a small object wrapped in leather. He handed it to Thomas.
A gift, the shaman said. From my people to yours.
Thomas unwrapped the leather carefully. Inside was a small carved figure, a bird with its wings spread wide. It was made of some dark wood, polished smooth by years of handling, and there were symbols carved into its surface that Thomas did not recognize. "This is a spirit bird," Running Elk explained. "It represents the soul that travels between worlds." The Cheyenne believe that when a good person dies, their spirit takes the form of a bird and flies to the sky world, where they are reunited with those they loved in life. Thomas felt tears prick at his eyes. He thought about Sarah, about the vision he had seen during that first ceremony so many years ago. She was waiting for him, she had said. They would be together again. "Thank you," he whispered. "I will treasure this." Running Elk placed his weathered hand on Thomas's forehead. "Go in peace, my friend," he said. "You have lived a good life. You have loved well and been loved in return. When your time comes, do not be afraid. The spirits will welcome you, and those who have gone before will be waiting to greet you." He rose to leave, pausing at the door to look back one last time. "Take care of him," he said to Little Dove. "He is one of the best men I have ever known, of any color or nation." Then, he was gone, disappearing into the autumn twilight, and Thomas never saw him again. He learned later that Running Elk had died that same night, passing peacefully in his sleep, his spirit finally answering the call it had been hearing for so long. The winter that followed was the hardest of Thomas's life. His body was failing now, the sickness no longer held in check by the medicine. He spent most of his days in bed, too weak to rise, too exhausted to do much more than lie still and wait for the end. Little Dove was constantly at his side, reading to him, talking to him, holding his hand when the pain became too much to bear. They talked about everything during those long winter nights. Thomas told her stories of his youth, of his parents and siblings, of the journey west and the building of the ranch. He told her about Sarah, about their love and their life together, about the grief that had nearly destroyed him when she died. He told her secrets he had never told anyone, fears and hopes and regrets that had been buried deep inside him for decades. Little Dove listened to it all, absorbing his words, committing them to memory. She asked questions, drew him out, helped him remember things he had thought forgotten. She was creating a record, Thomas realized. A chronicle of his life, preserved in her mind, to be passed down to future generations. It was the Cheyenne way, the way of her ancestors, and he was honored to be part of it. She told him stories too. Stories of her people, of the great chiefs and warriors who had come before, of the battles won and lost, of the long struggle to survive in a world that seemed determined to destroy them. She told him about her mother and father, about her brother who had died in the snow, about the relatives she had never gotten the chance to know. She told him about her hopes for the future, about the plans she was making for the ranch, about the school she wanted to create. "I'm going to call it the Whitmore Cheyenne Academy," she said one night, as the fire crackled and the wind howled outside. "A place where native children can learn the skills they need to succeed in the white man's world, without having to give up their own heritage. A bridge between two worlds, just like you wanted." Thomas felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the fire. "That's beautiful," he said. "Your mother would be proud. So am I." Little Dove smiled, but there were tears in her eyes. "I couldn't have done any of it without you," she said. "You saved me, Thomas. In every way a person can be saved. You gave me a home and a family and a future. You taught me to be strong and kind and true. Everything good that I am, everything good that I will ever do, is because of you." Thomas reached out and took her hand, his grip weak but steady. "You saved me too," he said. "That night in the storm, when I gave you my medicine, I thought I was throwing my life away. But I was wrong. I was giving myself a reason to live. You brought joy back into my life, Little Dove. You reminded me what it means to love and be loved. These years with you have been the happiest of my life, happier even than the years with Sarah. I don't regret a single moment." They sat together in silence, holding hands, watching the fire burn down. The words that needed to be said had been said. What remained was simply the being together, the sharing of presence, the connection that transcended words. spring came slowly, as it always did in Montana. The days grew longer, the temperature rose, the snow began to melt. Thomas watched it all from his window, too weak now to leave his bed, but still alert, still present. He watched the birds return from the south, watched the first green shoots push through the brown earth, watched the world come back to life after the long winter sleep. He knew the end was near. He could feel it in his bones, in the gradual slowing of his heart, in the increasing difficulty of each breath. But he was not afraid. Running Elk had promised him that the spirits would welcome him, that Sarah would be waiting. He had the carved spirit bird clutched in his hand, a talisman of hope, a reminder that death was not an ending but a transition. On a warm evening in late April, with the setting sun streaming through the window and Little Dove sitting beside him, Thomas Whitmore closed his eyes for the last time. He did not go alone. He felt hands guiding him, voices welcoming him, a warmth and light that was beyond anything he had ever experienced. He saw Sarah waiting for him, young and beautiful as she had been on their wedding day, her arms open wide to receive him. He saw Running Elk standing nearby, no longer old and frail but strong and straight, a smile of welcome on his weathered face. He saw others too, people he had loved and lost over the long years of his life, all gathered to greet him in this place beyond places. He looked back one last time, back toward the world he was leaving behind. He saw Little Dove kneeling beside his body, tears streaming down her face, her lips moving in a prayer that was part Christian and part Cheyenne. He saw the cabin that had been his home for so many years, the land he had worked and loved, the ranch that would now pass to his daughter. He felt a moment of sadness at leaving it all behind, but only a moment. He had done what he came to do. He had lived a good life. He had loved and been loved in return. He turned toward the light and walked forward, into the embrace of those who waited for him. Little Dove buried Thomas beside Sarah, under the old oak tree behind the cabin. She marked his grave with a simple stone, carved with his name and the dates of his birth and death. But she added something else, something that was not visible to the outside world. On the side of the stone that faced Sarah's grave, she carved a small symbol, a Cheyenne blessing that meant "Journey well, beloved one." The ranch became a school, just as she had promised. It took years to build, years of work and struggle and setback, but Little Dove never gave up. She used Thomas's savings to build classrooms and dormitories, to hire teachers and buy books, to create a place where Native children could learn without losing their identity. She called it the Whitmore Cheyenne Academy, and in time it became one of the most respected institutions of its kind in the territory. Students came from reservations all over the region, young people hungry for knowledge, desperate for opportunity, determined to build better lives for themselves and their families. They learned reading and writing and arithmetic, but they also learned their own languages and histories and traditions. They learned to bridge the gap between two worlds, just as Little Dove had done. Little Dove herself became a legend in her own right. She lived to be 93 years old, outliving most of the people who had known her in her youth. She saw the world change in ways that Thomas could never have imagined. She saw automobiles replace horses, airplanes take to the sky, men walk on the moon. She saw her people slowly regain some of what had been taken from them, saw the reservation system reformed, saw Native Americans begin to reclaim their place in American society. But, through all the changes, she never forgot where she came from. She never forgot the blizzard that had killed her mother and brother, or the dying rancher who had given her his last medicine. She never forgot Running Elk and his healing ceremonies, or the spirits who had intervened to save a lonely white man and a frightened Native girl. She told the story to anyone who would listen, and she made sure it was written down, so that future generations would know. The story spread, growing larger and more mythic with each telling. Some people dismissed it as legend, the kind of heartwarming tale that people make up to feel good about the world. But others believed it was true. They believed that sometimes, when you give away everything you have, the universe gives back in ways you could never imagine. And, perhaps, in the end, it does not matter what is literally true and what is embellished by time and memory. What matters is the lesson that the story teaches. What matters is the example it sets. A dying man found a child in the snow. He could have turned away, could have preserved his medicine for himself, could have chosen his own survival over hers. But he did not.
He chose compassion over self-interest, generosity over fear, love over loneliness.
And, in doing so, he changed not only his own life, but the lives of countless others who came after. That is the true legacy of Thomas Whitmore. Not the land he owned, not the cattle he raised, not even the school that bears his name. His legacy is the ripple effect of a single act of kindness, spreading outward through time and space, touching lives he never knew, changing a world he never saw. And, perhaps that is all any of us can hope for. Not to live forever, but to live in such a way that our lives matter. Not to escape death, but to face it knowing that we made a difference. Not to be remembered by everyone, but to be remembered by someone, for something good. Thomas Whitmore was a dying rancher who gave his last medicine to a child he had never met. By morning, the shaman was at his bedside, and miracles began to unfold. But the real miracle was not the medicine that saved his life. The real miracle was the love that saved his soul. And that kind of miracle happens every day, to ordinary people in ordinary circumstances, whenever they choose compassion over convenience, generosity over greed, connection over isolation. All it takes is one person, making one choice, in one moment of crisis. All it takes is a single act of kindness, offered without expectation of reward. All it takes is love. And love, as Thomas Whitmore learned, is the most powerful medicine of all.